like, so the
All right,
band of the shirt.
I am going to get started with this event for the evening. Thank you all for coming out to hear Jeffrey Tucker of the Brownstone Institute and so many other affiliations. I will briefly introduce the speaker and then we will kick this thing off here. Jeffrey A. Tucker is the founder and president of the Brownstone Institute and the author of many thousands of articles in the scholarly and popular press, as well as 10 books in 5 languages, most recently, Liberty or Lockdown. He is also the editor of the Best of Mises. Tucker studied economics and academia, had a close professional relationship with the Austrian economist Murray Rothbard for the 10 years before his death, and published hundreds of books on economics, money, and banking during his long tenure at the Mises Institute. He then rebooted the bookseller Laissez-Faire, during which time he wrote columns on finance, economic trends, and politics for Agora Financial. His next company, Liberty.me, was one of the earliest for-profit spaces to accept cryptocurrency in payment for subscriptions. Today, he writes a daily column on economics for the Epoch Times and speaks widely on the topics of economics, technology, social philosophy, and culture. Tucker's favorite economists are Mises and Hayek, which is a very common response around here.
Everybody.
So please welcome Jeffrey Tucker.
Thank you. You know, it's a little bit embarrassing, but I'm going to try an experiment tonight in 2 ways. For years, I've been lectures, and one thing I learned about speaking is I'm much better off when I don't prepare. I just stand up and just make it up and whatever. For some reason it turns out better. I can do this for hours, right? But tonight is slightly different because we're going to talk about some some precision and some specific things. So I'm going to try my best to adhere to what is in effect a prepared presentation. I'm probably not going to do a very good job of it, but I just got the good news today that it is going to appear in a publication called Imprimis. Do you know it? Yeah. That's good. So I'm excited about that. The other thing that's really spooky about what's about to happen is that I have slides. And I've never done this before because the first time I tried it, everybody was just staring at my PowerPoint presentation like it was Netflix or something. And I couldn't get anybody to listen to a word I was saying. Right? So I never again used that. But tonight I have some fancy charts, some of which are quite impressive. So I couldn't decline the temptation to do that. Listen, I must say too that it's a real pleasure to be at Hillsdale, which is one of the few colleges in the entire country that didn't go along with the nonsense, by which I hope you know what I mean by that. However, the New York Times yesterday ran an article explaining to us how we should manage the very risky thing of gathering in congregate settings where, if you do that, you might pick up the new variant of COVID. So they said that you should call in advance and make sure everybody is vaccinated. I failed to do that. My apologies. They also said that you should quarantine 2 weeks before any family gatherings. I've not done that. And that you should test 48 hours before, and 24 hours before, and that you should meet only outside. So in all these respects, we are all failing by standards of the universe. Well, what a time to be a student, huh? Right? The world went nuts and is still nuts on the flight from DC to Detroit. Half the people were wearing N95s. So we're living in a very strange time. I hope to leave some time for questions because, I'm sorry to say this, but this is all I've done for 2.5 years is study the madness of our times. And because it was the last thing I expected, I spent most of my career as a kind of a Whiggish intellectual looking forward to the eternal progress of humanity, and then one day, everything went dark. And that was very difficult. Very difficult. It was for you too. It was for everybody. And it's hard to see the world sort of careen off track, off the inevitable trajectory towards prosperity and freedom and happiness for all and emancipation of all, the human family, into darkness, segregation, mythology, and nonsense. And that has been going on for a long time. It's very hard to watch that happen, at least for me. So we're going to talk about the economic disaster, the pandemic response, about which hardly anybody speaks. People go to the store and they buy chicken and rice, and it costs $45, and they think, how did that happen? You know? People are just now coming to terms with the fact that there will be no going back to the old prices, and I can't understand it. We're going to go through some of the data. I'll show you some of the responses, and I hope this presentation inspires some of you to pick up the subject and investigate it more carefully, because God knows we need writers and researchers out there looking into this, because if we don't look into it and understand it, we're going to repeat it again and again and again forever. We can't live like this. All right, so I will begin. By the way, how do you change, if I were to show a first slide, how would one do that?
Just put the right arrow key on that.
That's how you work it, okay. On April 15th, 2020, now this is a full month after the lockdowns began, which you recall was on March 16th. That was the press conference at which Deborah Birx helpfully explained, all we're really trying to say is that we want everybody to stay separate from everybody else for a while. What? Is it a new social order? I mean, a brand new experiment and treating humanity as lab rats? We're going to do that? And the press was like, oh, good point. Okay. Anyway, that was March 16th. April 15th, a full month after that news conference, 15 days to flatten the curve, which Birx later revealed was not really about 15 days to flatten the curve. Why did they choose that? I'm pretty sure it's because 15 and flatten rhyme. This is the way politicians think. Or that it's an alliterative, you know. She later said, oh, they're just trying to get him to go along with things. Well, Trump is trying to catch on. And said to Fauci, this is according to Jared Kushner, said, I'm not going to preside over the funeral of the greatest country in the world, Trump said, a month after the lockdowns, after his Easter, hopefully, opening had already blown by. He said, I'm not going to preside over the funeral. And Fauci responded, I understand. I just do medical advice. I don't think about things like the economy and secondary impacts. I'm just a humble infectious disease doctor, that's all he is. Your job as president is to take everything else, whatever that may be, into consideration. And that conversation was very instructive because it reflected both the tone and entrenched the tone of the debate over lockdowns and vaccine mandates, and eventually the national crisis and everything that it precipitated. In these debates in the early days and even today, the idea of the economy was viewed as mechanistic and money-centered, and mostly about the stock market. Who cares about that? And detached from anything truly important. And that was always pitted against public health and lives. You have to choose one or the other. You can't have both, or so they said. And in those days, it was widely believed, stemming from a very strange ideology hatched 16 years earlier, that the best approach to pandemics was to institute massive human coercion like we've never before experienced. The theory was that if you make humans behave like non-player characters in computer models, you can keep them from infecting each other until a vaccine arrives, which will eventually wipe out the pathogen. One of these guys, Richard Hatchett, is one of the theorists behind lockdowns, said in an interview in a book that came out by Michael Lewis last year, he said, look, my view is that if we could put everyone in a small room, alone, forever, they would never catch a disease. I don't know. Anyway, the new lockdown theory stood in contrast to a century of pandemic advice and practice from public health wisdom. Only a few cities ever tried these things before. In 1918, San Francisco. I seem to vaguely remember there was something happened in Chicago, I'm not sure, but the quarantines were never tried, even in 1918 in New York or anywhere else. 1929, parrot flu, no lockdowns. 1940, 44, polio scares, no lockdowns, nothing. There was a swimming pool in Austin, Texas that closed, that was about it. 1957, 58, the Asian flu, that was had a very high infection fatality rate, very wicked. New York Times said, just calm down, if you get sick, go to the doctor, all right? That's how we deal with pandemics around here. In 1968, 69, we held Woodstock, right? That was an interesting one, because I wrote an article about that. It went viral, and one of the organizers for Woodstock said, oh, that's ridiculous. There was no pandemic. At the time, we had absolutely no consciousness of any flu. Well, my friend, the intrepid Phil Magnus, dug out an article from January 1969, in which that same exact guy told a local reporter, well, we're terrified about this flu coming up, you know. So we've got a lot of doctors on hand just in case. The guy's a bloody liar. Anyway, that was 68. 2003, SARS-1, no lockdowns, none. Of course, World Health Organization took credit for stopping it. You know that, right? That was very wicked, because it's not true. The bureaucrats always do that. 2005, that was the avian bird flu. Wow, we almost locked down for that one, but you know, there was a slight problem. The birds, you know, got a little cough, you know, felt a little weak for a few days, but that was it. They shook it off. Never went to humans, so that was very disappointing for the bureaucrats, very anxious to try it. Lockdown theory back then, damn. 2009, you know, that was a heck of a thing. That was H1N1. Same thing as 1918. Obama was president. They said, Mr. President, we got a flu. We better lock down. He's like, look, people are afraid this financial crisis is going on. We're looking at a population that's worried they can't even get money out of their ATMs. I'm not going to be worrying about a flu. And everybody said, okay. So that came and went. And everybody was urging calm in those days. But somehow, for reasons that should be discussed, and it could be intellectual error, political priorities, or some other combination, 2020 became the year of an experiment without precedent, not only in the US, but all over the world, with the exception of perhaps 5 nations, among which we can include South Dakota, but it also included such strange places as Tanzania, Nicaragua, how about that? Sweden, Belarus, a handful of other islands in the Scandinavian region. Other than that, every other country in the world locked down. The sick and the well were quarantined along with stay-at-home orders, domestic capacity limits, business, school closures, shutdown. You remember the whole nonsense. Nothing turned out as planned. The economy cannot be turned off using coercion. But it can be done, but the resulting trauma is so great that turning it on again is not so easy. Instead, 30 months later, we face an economic crisis without precedent. In our lifetimes, the longest period of declining real income in the post-war period, 18 months, 19 months now, a health and education crisis, exploding national debt, pushing inflation to a 40-year high, continuing seeming random shortages, still going on. Dysfunction in labor markets defies all models. Breakdown of international trade, God, it's a hell of a thing. Collapse of consumer confidence, not since since we've been gathering these numbers in a dangerous wave of political division. And what happened to COVID? Well, as everyone predicted, as my friends predicted, and I predicted from the beginning, everybody got it. And we got over it. We shook it off, and we scaled up our immune systems. It's a little thing we're learning about nowadays called the immune system. Fascinating. We've only known about it for 2,500 years. We decided to forget about it the last 2.5. Okay, we all got the pathogen. That's it. All right. Even if the lockdowns had saved lives, the proper, and which the literature shows that it's very unclear whether that's true, and it's probably no. The proper question to have asked is, at what cost? That's the economic question. What are the trade-offs? Because economics is such a shell for the emergency, the question is not raised at all. Thus did the White House on March 16th send out, this is the actual order. These are the words, March 16th, 2020. Bars, restaurants, food courts, and gyms, and other indoor and outdoor venues where groups of people congregate should be closed. I'm not sure there's a more totalitarian order ever issued in the history of humanity by any government. And everybody said, okay. Well, the lockdowns kicked off a whole range of other policy decisions, among which an epic bout of government spending. Okay, now we can, check it out. Now you see why I have charts, right? That's a good chart. All right, so here we go. Life's normal, life's normal. Government gets involved. This is total debt and a percentage of the debt of the gross domestic product. Gross domestic product. I don't know what the proper number is. What percentage of debt do you want should be the national debt be of the gross national product? I don't know what a gross domestic product. I don't know what the proper number is. I don't know when it becomes a disaster. But it strikes me that 130. Let's see, what is the height there? 134% is pretty darn high. So that's what happened to us. This all began, government created spending in the COVID response to at least $6 trillion above normal operations, creating debt that the Federal Reserve purchased with newly created money. You know how it goes, right? So something like a week after lockdowns began, Congress got a bill. I asked how long the bill was. I asked this of Thomas Massie. He said, how many pages? He goes, well, you know, things aren't calculated in pages anymore. We just get these gigantic files. You just scroll through them real quickly, or not at all. Just hop to the end and vote yes or no. That's the way it works. $1.7 trillion. So a lot of governors, when they first locked down, they're like, oh my God, there's a pathogen on the loose, let's lock down. But they wouldn't have stayed locked down for very long because their tax revenue would have dried up. But at that very moment, the US Congress started dumping $2 trillion all over the economy, and the governors and the mayors and public health officials and everybody's like, well, this is working out pretty well for us, this whole lockdown thing. Let's see how long we can keep this racket going. Well, the Fed got busy. So Congress spends the money. Treasury creates the debt. The Federal Reserve buys the debt with newly created money. That's the way it works. Here we go. Blue line, M2 money stock. Almost a dollar for dollar buying of everything that Congress created. Dollar for dollar. I don't know where this inflation comes from. It's just a complete mystery, you know? Okay, M2 increased by an average of $814.3 billion per month between February and May. On May 18th, it was 2020, M2 was rising 22% a year over year, compared to 6.7% from March of that year. Did I do this in percentage increases? Yes, I do. There you can see, right? And so we went just like, M2 was increases. I don't use M1, by the way, because they changed the definition in May. Did you know that? It was very strange why they did that. But anyway, it was rising 6.7%. Suddenly, it's going up and up and up. And then finally, it peaked at 27.5% increases. At the same time, the velocity of money, which is the pace at which money is spent, collapsed. You can see the velocity collapsed, which actually keeps, what that means is that if you know anything about the equation of its exchange, which is the way we predict how inflation would work, the V goes down, the M goes vastly up, and they sort of more or less for a temporary time cancel out each other, right? So delay the effects. Push the bad effects in the case of quantitative easing off into the future. The problem is that future is now. We have the highest inflation in 40 years, which is not slowing down but accelerating, at least according to the Producer Price Index from October 12th. It's hotter now than it's been in months and running ahead of the Consumer Price Index, which is a reversal from an earlier lockdown period where initially, do I have a chart on this? What do I do? This is fascinating. Look what happens here. Okay, this is an overlay of CPI and PPI. This blue line is what the producers are paying for goods and services, and the red line is what consumers are paying. So you see early in the lockdown period, prices were rising much more slowly on the consumer level than they rising much more slowly on the producer level than they were on the consumer level. So that was a kind of a bit of a subsidy temporarily to producers. So their profit margins weren't being squeezed in the early days. But that all began to change. Basically, at the time Biden was inaugurated, suddenly the producer price index starts rising much faster than the consumer price index, and producers are unable to pass costs on anymore. So they tried various tricks, right? Shrinkflation, so your candy bars are smaller, your bag of chips is lower, everything's smaller now than it used to be. Airlines ding you for everything. It's anything to pass on the cost to the consumer is becoming increasingly difficult. So now producer prices are rising much faster than consumer prices. Consumer prices are what producers can get away with, but consumers are coughing it all up now. This is not just a US problem. Most nations in the world followed the same lockdown strategy. Here's another good excuse for having slides. This one is great. Ha! All right. Here we see, please admire my chart making skills, right? No, this is great. This is great. Yeah. This is the greatest chart. Yeah, I stop people on the street and show them this one. Like, this is what I do for a living. Here we have the money supply for the US in blue, the UK in red, and green for the whole of the EU. And you can see that they all went up in coordinated fashion. Central banks were all coordinating with each other, So what I did with the, so I took the same colors using a clever little tool, trademarked Jeffrey Tucker, and I just took the same colors and charted prices, the pace of price increases. Now, Milton Friedman in the old days used to say that inflation's always and everywhere a monetary phenomenon, but that prices will always go up with a lag, say 18 months would be, a typical thing. But well, sure enough, that's exactly what happens, right? So all the prices from all the countries began to respond pretty much in proportion to their level of inflation, right? So when people tell you that the reason for the price increases are supply chain breakages, all right, yeah, that causes some sectors to shift. Or Putin, or Putin's price hike. Remember they tried to fob that one off on us for a long time? And then more recently, it's OPEC. Everybody gets the blame except the Fed. No, the Fed's there to fix inflation, So anyway, here you see all central banks in the world coordinating. Like, how stupid can we be? Is there not a relationship here between the price level and the money supply? Is there not? I mean, how much more, are you not entertained? Come on. All right, now we're going to talk about what I think is the most extraordinary thing of all. That's what I call the great head fake of the whole period. Back in the spring and summer of 2020, we seemed to experience a miracle. Governments around the country had crushed social function and free enterprise, and yet real income went soaring. Between February 20 and March 2021, real personal income during a time with low inflation was up $4.2 trillion. Personal income lockdowns, and we were getting rich. It felt like magic. Maybe you remember these days. I mean, you weren't doing anything, and the government was giving you money. It was like, this is great. Why can't we just have a system like this? This is great. I mean, I drink too much at night, get up a little late, don't have to shower, put on my PJs, open up my computer, pretend to pay attention to the classes, and the government gives me money for it. And there was Amazon. So that workers and peasants deliver my stuff to me, while I stay safe from a pathogen. I, among the clean, will stay free of COVID. And there was Netflix. Boy, that got boring. And there were times that everybody unsubscribed there for a while. And there was all sorts of needs for all sorts of new equipment to feed our existence as digital everything. All these companies benefited enormously while others suffered. We paid off credit card debt. Those were good days. and much of the stimulus was socked away as savings. First, the money went straight to the bank. The personal savings went from, get this, 9.6 to 9.6% of personal income to 33% in the course of just 1 month. We've never seen savings like this. We're paying off debt, saving money, watching Netflix, loving the showers, drinking too much. It was great. And all summer, people started to get the hang of this free money from government. But then, savings began to fall. And I'm just going to flip over to this next chart because this is the masterpiece. All right. All right. Now let's let you examine that. The savings rates began to fall. By November 2020, it was back down to 13.3%. Joseph Biden came to power and unleashed a new round of stimulus, and the savings rate went back up. And just forward to the present, we find people saving now only 3.5% of income, which is half the historical norm dating back to 1960. So people squandered every bit of it. Every bit of it is gone. And as now where it was in 2005 when interest rates fed the housing boom that went bust in 2008. Meanwhile, credit card debt is now soaring, even though interest rates are 17% and higher. In other words, we experienced the wild swings from shocking riches to rags in a very short period of time, and the curves all inverted once the inflation came along to eat out the value of the stimulus. And all that free money turned out not to be free at all, but rather very expensive. And the dollar of January 2020 is now worth only 87 cents. Can you believe I'm even saying all that? I still can't believe the world in which we live. Which is to say that the stimulus spending covered the Federal Reserve printing. They stole about 13 cents of every dollar in the course of only 2.5 years. It's one of the biggest head fakes in the history of modern economics. The pandemic planners created paper prosperity to cover up for the grim reality all around, but it did not and could not last. Right on schedule, the value of the currency began to tumble. Between January 2021 and September 2022, prices increased 13.5% across the board, while costing the average American family $728 in September, last month alone. Even if inflation stops today, the inflation already in the bag will cost the American family about $9,000 over the next 12 months, leaving less money to pay off soaring debts. So you can see I charted all this, and it's just absolutely insane, isn't it? Look at that. I mean, the green here, we have personal savings. Wow, we're saving so much money. I'm rich. And then it just goes away, and then it goes away again. Now we're poor, and real personal income goes through the roof with lockdowns and begins to fall. This is income adjusted for inflation, of course. And then Biden comes along and says, no, we really are rich. Watch, boom. And then that collapsed really quickly. And then, and now here's what's happening to debt, right? Debt. So you see what's happening, right? All the money just was inflated away, and Americans took the bait, spent like crazy, stopped saving money, and now they're trying to keep up their lifestyles, keep everything going, maxing out their credit cards. Now interest rates are increasing at a faster rate than ever before on record in the history of the Federal Reserve. We've never seen interest rates increase this far, this fast. Now, it's only 3.5%, something like the federal funds rate. That's not that high by historical standards, but we've never seen it happen in such a short period of time. It's like a 5,000% increase from 0 to 3.5 is very extreme. So that's why the housing crash and everything else, and that's why credit cards. So you see, this is robbery through a little bit of trickery. I mean, it's brilliant what they did. I mean, it's unbelievable what they achieved. The great head fake. All right, let's return to the salad days before. How are we doing on time? Okay, we're good. Is anybody bored? It's pretty interesting, right? So good. Okay, all right, that's right, yeah. Let's return to the salad days before the inflation hit, when the Zoom class experienced delight at their new riches. On Main Street, things looked really different. I remember I went to 2 small towns, and well, you probably did this too, in the late spring, in New Hampshire and in Texas, and it was dreadful. All malls were empty, but a few masked maintenance men, and churches were silent and abandoned. There was no life at all, just despair. The whole look of America in those days was post-apocalyptic, with vast numbers of people huddled in home, either alone or with immediate families, fully convinced that a universally deadly virus was lurking outdoors and waiting to snatch the life of anyone foolish enough to seek exercise, sunshine, or heaven forbid, have fun with friends. Meanwhile, the CDC was recommending that all essential businesses install plexiglass and paste social distancing stickers everywhere, all in the name of science. It all sounds ridiculous, but personally, I mean, this probably happened to you. I was screamed at several times for walking the wrong direction in the grocery aisle. Did that ever happen to you? I mean, this is in Massachusetts where people could be, this is a place that burned witches in the old days. Now, you know, in 2020, they're burning COVID non-compliers. They were flying drones all over town. Private parties were flying drones to take pictures of houses. They had too many cars and then turn them into the local press, and they would be on the front page of the paper the next day as a COVID non-complier. This is this country. This is where we lived. This were times when people were insisting on riding elevators alone. Parents masked their kids, and even though the kids were at zero risk. Nearly all schools were closed, thus forcing parents out of office back home. Homeschooling, which long existed under legal fog, suddenly became mandatory. A friend of mine came to visit me when he got back home to Atlanta, whose mother insisted that he leave all his bags on the porch for 3 days so they could air out from all the COVID in them. You know, so I tell the story. It didn't make it into Imprimis, but I was in Hudson, New York, and I was waiting for a train. And, well, the train was late. And so I walked into a wine bar. I was trying to think, this is the winter of 2020. So it was cold, right? So we're talking about like November, December. And I walked into a wine bar, and masked lady, probably had a shield on her face too, said, Ed, what would you like? And I said, well, I'll just have a glass of wine. So she gave it to me. I was looking over there, and there's a whole empty room. And she pointed outdoors. Okay, it's like 33 degrees outside. And I said, great, so you want me to go outside and drink my glass of wine? She said, well, yeah, so you have to. So, you know, one thing I might do is, you know, step into that room right there. She goes, nope, COVID. I said, oh, is it a law? She said, no, it's not a law. I said, so on your own as a business, you have decided that I can't go into that room because of COVID. And she said, that's right. And I said, do you think that COVID is in that room? She said, yes. Yeah. So these were days when, in the early days of the pandemic, you know, everybody was sure that COVID was, where was COVID in the early days? Oh, COVID was outside in the early days of the pandemic, so everybody had to stay inside. But then later it changed, right? Everybody decided that COVID was probably inside. And so now we have to all go outside. And so the poor businesses in New York were like very confused. First they made them shut down their outdoor dining because there's COVID outside. And then they said, wait a minute, we made a mistake. COVID is outside. No, it's the river. So no, then, well, at some point they made them come outside and leave the inside, so they had to build, every restaurant in New York had to build like an outside version of indoors. I don't know if you went there during the pandemic, it's hilarious. All the restaurants had beautiful restaurants inside. They built separate restaurants out on the street, you know, with walls and heaters and everything else, because that's what COVID was not there. So anyway, 100,000 restaurants closed in Manhattan alone. All right, let's bump forward to talk about something very strange, I think. It's one of the strangest things. During this deadly, deadly pandemic, healthcare spending collapsed, and so did healthcare employment. How do you account for that, right? Historians, looking back at this period, are going to say, wait, what kind of pandemic is it where personal consumption expenditures on healthcare services collapsed? They went down and then suddenly soared again afterwards. Well, what happened was there was an edict that went out all over the country. It said all hospitals have to close to all things that are not related to COVID. And so basically all over the country, everywhere in the country, the parking lots of hospitals and healthcare centers just emptied out. They were just gone. So all diagnostics were gone. Any elective surgeries were out of the question. And by elective, it's not just like, oh, I'll take that surgery or not. You know, it was that. It was like, you know, things that were essential, but were elective in terms of the date in which you came in. In other words, non-emergency surgeries. They were all ended all over the country. Somebody needs to figure out why this happened. I still don't understand it. Absolutely bizarre. CDC. All healthcare space in the country has to be reserved for COVID alone. And you might say, well, it's because we're trying to keep the hospitals from being overwhelmed. They were never overwhelmed. All the data has come out already on hospital bed use in New York at the time, which is as bad as it ever got anywhere in the country. It was below norm in New York, too. Poor Trump sent a whole hospital, Navy ship, to New York, is never even used. Okay, it's crazy. Healthcare spending collapsed, and everybody missed their cancer screenings and got sicker than ever. And of course, this is what happens afterwards. It's the same thing happened with employees in healthcare. The nurses were furloughed from hundreds of hospitals over the country during a pandemic. That is weird. And then, when things started getting back to normal, they said, hey, everybody, you got to get, here's your shots you have to get, it's mandatory. Well, they were already exposed. They bravely faced the virus, got natural immunity, and then they were going to make them accept the big mRNA shot, Absolutely cruel. So it just absolutely destroyed the healthcare industry, but after facing this level of financial drain early in the pandemic, they were super excited when the subsidies came out that paid the hospitals for everybody they vented and everybody they called COVID, which massively led to an enormous misclassification crisis in the country. So suddenly everybody had COVID, everybody's testing COVID, everybody who's died is dying from COVID, and so on and so on, just because Medicare had given every hospital a 20% premium on everybody who was classified as COVID. It's just a fact. Economics matters, my friends, even in healthcare. The throttling of healthcare even extended to dentistry, and I'll tell you a quick story. One day I was eating a burrito, and I felt something in my tooth. I was like, it's a little bit of a strange feeling. In retrospect, it was just that sometimes burritos can be a little gummy and stick in your tooth. It felt like I might have needed what's called a root canal, right? This thing's terrible. Now, when you have to have one, you have to have one. So I panicked. So I called up the dentist, and they said, well, I can't see it now because of COVID. I need a root canal. But I'm sorry. We're only open for emergencies. And I said, but if this is an emergency, what is? She said, well, it's true it might be an emergency, but in order to see you, we first have to give you a checkup and a cleaning. That is not an emergency. It's like, this is crazy. So I called on my mother in Texas, and I said, Mom, my wonderful dentist there, I may have to come down to Texas just to go to the dentist, if you can believe it. She goes, okay, let me make you an appointment. She called him up. So my son wants to come in. They said, I'm sorry, but he has to quarantine for 2 weeks before we can see him. So she called me up, bad news, you have to quarantine for 2 weeks. I said, well, I can't do that. Am I going to come to Texas for 2 weeks just to go to the dentist? She said, well, there's no other way to do it. I said, Mom, one thing you might consider. She said, stop right there, I'm not going to lie. I said, all right. So fortunately, it just turned out to be a little piece of burrito in my tooth, and I didn't need a root canal. But this is what happened, right? We got rid of dentistry in this country for the better part of 6 weeks. It was a time of great public insanity, not stopped and even fomented by public health bureaucrats, and all of which reminded me of the headline in the New York Times, February 28th, 2020, to take on the coronavirus, go medieval on it. We did. We even got rid of dentistry. All right, let's talk about labor markets. We'll wrap up. How did it come to be the entire workforce was divided between essential and unessential? How did that happen? Most of the lists said that if you were operating as a media center, you were essential. So for New York Times, for 2 years, the New York Times kept instructing everybody what to do because of the pandemic. What they said was, stay home and order your groceries to be delivered. Think about that language. To be delivered by whom? Not readers of the New York Times. Surely not. Right? There's a really class element here, right? It's like the workers and peasants are going to come to work for us, we, the readers of the New York Times. This is the way they did it. When the labor markets went nuts, especially with vaccine mandates, I was looking up the data now, at least 8 million people, at least, probably closer to 10, either quit or were fired or otherwise displaced because of vaccine mandates. The truth about the labor markets requires we look at the labor participation rate and the worker population ratio. Millions have gone missing. These are women working who still cannot find childcare because that industry has never recovered. And so labor participation among women is back to 1988 levels. Have you read about that in the news? There should be a women's march about that. Not heard a word about it. Many 20-somethings just moved home and went on unemployment benefits, and there are many who have just lost the will to achieve and build a future. So let's look at labor participation. That's what it looks like. It's pretty grim, right? Middle line, employment population ratios. Top line, labor for participation men still hasn't recovered from pre-pandemic levels. And then labor participation rate. Women, the red line, still down. You have to trace it back in time. It goes all the way back to 1988. This is the true story of what happened to labor markets in this country. It's an unbelievable tragedy, but you know what I'm talking about. You know people who have just basically dropped out of life. If you run a regression on the numbers as they were increasing prior to the pandemic, we've seemed to have lost about 8.3 million people from the labor force. 8.3 million. All right, supply chains. I'll just mention a couple of cases here before finishing up. The supply chain crisis is a weird one on its own, but you know, in the US we have these just-in-time inventory strategies. We've been using them for 40 years, adopted from the Japanese and so on. So the car manufacturers did this for chips. So when everything shut down, they said, well, cancel all the orders for chips. And then 6 months later, they said, well, now it's time to start selling, we'll finish up our cars and get them sold. Say, click, 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 chips. We don't have any chips. Wait, what happened to the chips? Well, you didn't order any chips from us for a long time. We started making chips for what they're really necessary for, which is laptop computers and cell phones, and gaming consoles are strangely popular now. So we don't have any chips for you. So all the factories overseas all retooled away from providing for chips. And so American car manufacturers got so desperate that many of them got rid of things like power steering and sold their cars anyway. Yeah, talk about going medieval. So we kept going back and back. Cream paper is another good example. Now here's why economics is fun. So I got a notice the other day that one book that we published, they said, well, I'm sorry, we can't use cream paper anymore because paper shortage is still going on. I said, what paper shortage? I didn't remember that. Well, sure enough, look it up. There's been a paper shortage since the summer. Why might that be? Because in the early days of the pandemic, when the government was flooding the economy with money and interest rates were zero, lots of people went out and bought houses, and a lot of construction companies started building houses for people to buy. And so a lot of the paper mills stopped making paper and started making lumber. And so that's why lumber prices went up, and then they came dramatically down. That's why. Well, it came at the expense of paper production. That's how economics works. You know, I just want to finish up here just to mention really quickly. Do you remember the toilet paper shortage? You do? That was a weird time, right? Am I really conserving toilet paper? So do you know what happened during that whole thing? So people think that the market somehow broke. The markets didn't break. What happened was that most of the toilet paper manufacturers in this country make toilet paper for where people mostly use it, which is at work. Those big rolls, special, work sort of facilities have different kinds of things than home. Like domestic toilet paper is very different from commercial toilet paper. So it took them several months to have to retool their factories to meet the vastly higher demand for domestic toilet paper. That's all that happened. There was really never a shortage. It was just all at the office, just not at home. True story. Incredible. All right. We could write books listing all the economic calamities caused by the disastrous pandemic response, and they'll be with us for years. And even today, not many people are grasping the relationship between our current hardships and what happened back in 2020. Anthony Fauci said at the outset, I don't think about things like the economy. Melinda Gates, genius epidemiologist that she is, said on an interview December 4th, 2020, what did surprise us is we hadn't really thought through the economic impacts. Oh, thanks. A wall of separation posited between economics and public health did not hold in theory or practice. A healthy economy is indispensable for a healthy people. Shutting down economic life was a singularly bad idea for taking on a pandemic. Economics is about people and their choices, and the institutions that make them thrive. Public health is about the same thing. Driving a wedge between the two surely ranks among the most catastrophic public policy decisions of our lifetimes. Health and economics both require the non-negotiable. That goes by the name of freedom. May we never again experiment with its near abolition in the name of disease mitigation. Thank you. So I guess we can have some dice. This is my favorite, right? Of all the charts, this is the goofiest, right? It's a great head fake. That'll consume about 10 minutes, people staring at us. All right, I know you have some comments or questions. And by the way, feel free to disagree with anything I said or be outraged or ask any questions you have. Yeah, go ahead.
I'm completely outraged over the inside. No, I'm just kidding. All right, so we see the inflation is just basically destroying the economy right now. And I heard in the intro that you have experience in digital currency, Bitcoin, deflationary asset. Where do you think that plays a role?
Well, one of the things that's fascinating about Bitcoin is I'm sort of what they call an old gangster in that space, right? I was in the markets from like 2012, really. And we used to believe that Bitcoin was somehow exogenous to all financial systems, that it would magically acquire this value by virtue of its beauty, technological beauty, and all the rest of it, and that it was going to go to the moon just because it was the first real usable private currency. But what we've learned over the last 3 years is that once the institutions got really involved in buying it, it goes up and down the same as all financial assets. And that's been an alarming discovery, I would say, for me personally. It's not that I ever expected Bitcoin to just go up forever and ever and ever, but just to see it move with financial assets like everything else. I mean, it benefited from lockdowns too, right? I mean, people just started buying Bitcoin because it was fun. But it peaked at, I think, 65,000. Now it's down to, I don't know, it was 20,000. It just seems to be migrating between 19. And which, by the way, is a miracle in itself, right? I mean, I remember when Bitcoin hit $1,000, I thought maybe people stopped calling it a racket now. They still call it a scam and a Ponzi scheme. It's neither. It's none of those things. It's a great tool. But it's still in a state of price discovery. I mean, it could stay where it is right now or fall much further. As far as I'm concerned, if Bitcoin is worth $1, that's amazing enough. So $19,000, I think that's pretty impressive. Yeah.
So the Fed has declared that they won't be raising interest rates in the year at least, and perhaps halfway through next year. Some people have said that the Fed is raising rates too much and that they're going to raise us straight into a recession. Are you at all worried about us being raising interest rates straight into a recession?
Well, that's what they're trying to do. They're trying to bring about a recession because they believe that a recession is the only way to control inflation. So these people are very old-style Keynesians. They can't let go of that old view. That the only way to conquer inflation is to bring about recession. And all the evidence of the world to the contrary is not going to convince them. The important thing about the experience from 1978 to 1982 is we learned that wasn't true. We conquered inflation now of course there was a recession, and it was brutal. On the other hand, during that recessionary period, there was massive tax cuts, massive deregulation of 3 huge industries, trucking, energy, and telecommunications all at once. with dramatic capital gains tax cuts. So that set up the economy really well for a wonderful recovery that turned out to last throughout the rest of the 1980s, 90s, and really all the way until the turn of the millennium. So that's what's missing now. So you have the Fed engaging in a war on inflation through these really fast increases with the purpose of, they think it's going to be a soft landing, but it's going to be a landing nonetheless. Whether it's going to be soft or hard, I don't know. But they are trying to prevent. So they believe that economic growth is a driver of inflation, and the Austrian school would say that's just complete rot. So we've got a really conflicting view here. Now, one of the things that's fascinating, and the Biden administration will tell you this, is that it's not really a recession environment because unemployment is so low. But remember, labor participation is very, very low. The other thing that's a little bit strange about that is that, we tend to treat labor markets as a homogeneous unit, the way people talk about capital, labor, same thing. It's not. We have a huge labor shortage in this country among people who are willing to work for wages and do like actual stuff, like real things, productive things. We have a surplus of workers in mid-level management positions, especially in HR. Well, I mean, in every other area. So my prediction that I made six months ago, I write for George Gilder's financial newsletter, where they always ask me to make predictions. It's very dangerous. When you make a prediction, always put either a number or a date, but never both. So anyway, I predicted what I called, after Keynes, the euthanasia of the Zoom class or the overclass, that businesses were going to see a profit squeeze, and they're going to be panicked about costs because they're not going to be able to pass them on to consumers anymore. They're going to start looking around their labor pools and find the useless people. Who are the useless people? Well, they're the people that it didn't really miss when they were staying home and staying safe. Those people are going to get the axe first. And sure enough, that's what's happened. There have been about 40,000 layoffs in the big tech sector and middle-level management positions over the last 3 months. And it's just going to get worse. So we are going to see an increase of unemployment. It's not going to be from Dunkin' Donuts and Chick-fil-A. It's going to be from the high-end, high-tech companies and their stuffy, overfed management, six-figure salary HR employees. Yes?
So unemployment, if someone's on unemployment beyond a certain point, they aren't counted anymore. Right?
Well, yeah, that's true. Yeah.
So where are we with those numbers? There's the numbers that they say are unemployed, but they only go back so far.
Mm-hmm.
How many people are actually employed? Or is that in this data?
It's in labor. Well, we only know that from labor participation. Another thing you can't trust is the numbers on job creation, because those are really high. But once you drill down to those numbers, you find out that people have second and third jobs. They're taking second and third jobs just to pay their stupid credit card bills and their mortgages. It's really grim what's happening. And the unemployment racket, boy, what a scam that is, right? And maybe you all knew this, but I was shocked by this. The way you keep unemployment going is keep applying for jobs, because you can't keep getting unemployment unless you're on the job market. So you set up a little thing on Indeed.com, dump resumes on as many companies as possible, and then pay no attention to them after that, and report to the unemployment people, I've applied for 6 jobs in the last week. What are you talking about? It's just nobody's hiring. Which is a real problem, because it ruined Indeed.com's numbers. And the Federal Reserve Bank of St. Louis has long used Indeed as a legitimate source to find out where the job openings are and how many people are out of work and how many people are applying for jobs, how many people are changing jobs. They used Indeed. I'm sorry, but that thing has been completely ruined because it was gamed during the whole unemployment period. I had a job I'm an idiot. I had a job that I was posting for Brownstone, and with very specific job requirements. And it was very specific about all the things I wanted. I thought maybe it was just a handful of people in the country. Well, within 3 days, I had like 3,000 applications. And I'm looking through these things, and I think all this is just nonsense. Every one of these things is just nonsense. And somebody revealed the racket to me. People just any job opening that anybody who's accepting applications, they apply for. You just become a magnet for scam artists trying to continue their unemployment benefits. Yeah.
So it seems like we've learned a lot about human nature over all of this.
Yeah, right.
In your personal opinion, do you think they could get us to go for this again on a mass scale?
Well, certainly they, yeah, I don't know. I mean, there's no question that they're planning to, you know? The ruling class has always got to have some way to inspire acquiescence to their program. And it's different in all times and all places, right? So in the religious wars, you know, in the 15th century, not believing in transubstantiation in Spain was a threat to the nation. And so it made sense that you should be burned at the stake. So, you know, the ruling class is always going to use whatever the prevailing cultural ethos is. And it just so happened in this country that it's been so long since we've really been scared of a pathogen, and so long since anyone paid any attention in 9th grade biology class, that it was ripe for a disease panic. Perfect. Everybody's stupid. We have lots of computers now. People can continue to make a living. Let's just get everybody whipped up in a frenzy about a pathogen that had already been here at least 6 months before. And you know that, right? We know this now. SARS-CoV-2 had been here since October 2019. All that time.
That's about what we have time for, so.
Oh,
let's give it-
really?
Yep, unfortunately.
But I wanted
We'll
to
wrap
make
it
one
up.
point that
Okay,
Tony Vera said,
one point.
it's difficult to make predictions, especially about the future.
That is true.
All right.
Thank you also
Well, I
so much
understand.
for listening.
Yeah.